Hey guys, so today we are moving on to chapter 11, which is the first chapter in your exam 3 material. Fortunately for this exam, we are going in order, so it will be chapters 11, 12, 13, and 14 all back to back. And this chapter is on sort of a bunch of different things, but mostly motivation, drives, and sort of those basic human needs that we all have and need to have met. Okay, so motivation is anything, a need or a desire that energizes and directs your behavior. And that's really the key component, is energizes and directs. Motivation is anything that sort of gives you that internal pull to do something. And so the first theory of motivation is instinct theory. And this essentially says that our instincts are the source of our motivations. We have an instinct to meet our most basic needs, like feeding ourselves, sleeping, those sorts of things. And, being hungry is certainly a motivator to go get food. Being tired is certainly a motivator to get some sleep, right? So instinct theory says our instincts are the source of our motivations. Our instincts are what cause us to feel motivated to do a behavior that will meet our basic instinctual needs. But know that an instinct is also some kind of complex behavior that is rigidly patterned throughout a species and is unlearned. So what this means is that for something to be an instinct, it has to be something that's common to an entire species and something that species doesn't have to learn to do. So again, you don't have to learn really to get food when you're hungry. That's a natural response to hunger. You don't have to learn to go to sleep when you're tired. That's a natural response to tiredness, right? And then a physiological need is anything that your physiological self, anything that your biological body needs in order to survive. So physiological need is a basic bodily requirement, like needing food or needing water or needing sleep. And then homeostasis. We're going to talk about homeostasis in several places in psychology, but homeostasis really just refers to this balancing point inside of your body where everything is at sort of its proper resting level. And if one of those levels gets knocked out of whack, your body will do a lot of hard work to make sure that you go back to a homeostatic or sort of just a resting average level of whatever that is. So, let's say your blood glucose drops, for example. Well, then your body's going to send you signals that you're hungry so that you'll go eat. And when you eat, any food that you bring in increases your blood glucose level, right? Because there's glucose in food. So the idea behind homeostasis, and this kind of will feed into our second theory, drive reduction theory. But the idea with homeostasis is if something gets knocked off balance in your body's going to do a lot of hard work to make sure that you come back to your resting, normal, average level of whatever that is, whether that's your pH, or it has to do with blood glucose, or it has to do with just your level of hunger or thirst. It could be any number of things, but there's always a level of homeostasis for just about anything, a balancing point inside of your body, or a regular level that needs to be kept approximately constant. An incentive is any kind of reward or threat that's going to motivate your behavior. So this kind of goes back into operant conditioning a little bit, a positive or negative environmental stimulus. So if we're talking about there's a bear chasing you, well, that's definitely an incentive to run away, right? That motivates you to run away. Or if you're hungry, that motivates you to go get food. That's an incentive, getting food, and, relieving your hunger is an incentive for searching for food or for eating, right? And then we have the second theory. So there's going to be 4 theories we talk about here, 4 motivational theories. And this is the second theory, drive reduction theory. And this says that a physiological need creates some kind of aroused state, and that aroused state is the drive that motivates the organism to satisfy the need. And here's what I want you to write down on your worksheet next to drive reduction theory. The goal of drive reduction theory is to achieve or maintain homeostasis. The goal of drive reduction theory is to achieve or maintain homeostasis. And so the idea here is that, when your homeostatic level gets knocked out of whack, something gets off balance, that creates a drive in your body, a motivation to reduce the need that you have to even that level back out. So you're driven to reduce the imbalance and bring yourself back to a resting homeostatic level of whatever in your body. Okay. Third theory is arousal theory. And this says that human motivation seeks to optimize your arousal for the best possible performance. And so we have this arousal curve that is super important. And this shows us that, so see, the x-axis is arousal. So if you're towards the left, that's low arousal. I have no, I'm kind of lethargic. I have really no real desire to do anything. Versus high arousal, oh my gosh, this is so important to me. This is crucial. I have to do well, on this task. So that's what the x-axis is, low arousal and high arousal. And then the y-axis is performance. How well are you actually going to perform based on the amount of arousal that you have? And so the idea here is, if you're on the low end, if we're over here, we don't have much arousal, we're fatigued, we're sleepy, maybe we're sleep deprived, right? And let's say that when we're talking about performance, we're talking about performance on an exam, right? So if you come into an exam and you're super tired, you're fatigued, you've been up all night studying, you're sleep deprived, or you just don't really care about this exam very much, you're just not motivated to do very well, your performance is going to be pretty low. You're going to do pretty poorly, right? But here's the problem. If you're really, really, really highly aroused, you have stress, anxiety, right? This is so important to you. It's crucial to do well on this. You're creating all of this anxiety for yourself. Well, your performance is going to suffer here too. Your performance is going to suffer here too. So you don't want to be, not aroused enough, but you also don't want to be too aroused. And so the idea with the Yerkes-Dodson law, this is crucial. The idea with the Yerkes-Dodson law is that actually middle of the road, medium arousal gets you the very best performance. So you don't want to be too, aroused, too anxious. You don't want to be not aroused enough, sleepy, fatigued, you don't care. But rather you want to be somewhere right in the middle there where you care enough, but you're still accepting, of what might happen. And that actually will get you the best performance possible. So that's important. Very, very important. The way that sometimes gets phrased on exams is, moderate arousal leads to the best performance, that sort of thing. Not too high, not too low. And then we've got Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this theory simply just says that we are most motivated to meet our very basic needs, and we cannot move on to meeting higher needs until our most basic needs are met. So if we look at this tower, there's actually one more at the top here that I think was more recently added, and that is self-transcendence. Self-transcendence. There we go. But looking at this chart, if your physiological needs aren't met, if you don't have water, food, shelter, then you're not really caring so much about something higher like your self-esteem, for example. Until our most basic needs are met, we aren't motivated to care about higher needs. That's really what Maslow's hierarchy of needs says, is our most basic needs have to be met before we can move on to satisfying higher level needs. Okay. So those are our 4 theories. Instinct theory says it's our instincts, our, unlearned species typical behaviors that influence our motivation. We're motivated to follow our instincts and meet our basic needs. Drive reduction theory says when we have a physiological need, we enter this aroused state that drives us to reduce the need, right? So if our need is hunger, we're going to reduce that feeling of hunger by eating, right? By meeting that need, by eating. Arousal theory says our optimal level of arousal is somewhere right in the middle, right? And that's where our performance is going to be at its maximum capacity. And then Maslow's hierarchy of needs says we prioritize our survival-based needs and then our social needs and then our needs for esteem and meaning, things like that. And you will want to memorize the order of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I'll go back for a brief moment and just talk to you about each of those needs. Okay, so physiological needs are things that you need in order to survive, things that your body needs in order to survive. So water, food, sleep, things like that. After that are safety needs. You need to make sure that you are safe, whether that's safe in your health, right, so that you can keep living and surviving, or safe in the sense that you need shelter, right? So next is safety. And then after that is love and belonging. Humans have this inborn need for socialization, love, and belonging to a group. So this has to do with, your friendships, your connection with your family, just really your sense of connection with anyone. Following that are your own esteem needs. Now that's kind of interesting because, we always tell people they have to love themselves before they can love others, right? But Maslow's hierarchy of needs actually says it's the opposite. You need to feel loved in order to love yourself. So after love and belonging, then comes esteem, respect, self-esteem, status, recognition, strength, freedom. All of these things you feel about yourself. After that is self-actualization. You're trying to become the best version of yourself that you can be. You're trying to actualize or attain the best version of yourself possible. And then, like I said, there's one more beyond this called self-transcendence, and that has to do with looking outside of yourself, usually towards like a higher power. And, self-transcendence is a little more spiritual, right? So this is more of that level of like spiritual awakening. Okay. Moving on to hunger. So know that glucose is sugar that circulates in your blood, and that is the major source of energy for your body tissues. So when you have low blood glucose, you feel hungry. We need more blood glucose to source our body's energy, right? And so when we have high levels of glucose, we feel full. We have enough of that energy saved up. So then you definitely want to know specifically about ghrelin and leptin. Ghrelin is the major hormone that stimulates your hunger. So ghrelin sends I'm hungry signals from your stomach to your brain, okay? Ghrelin increases your appetite. And so does orexin, which is secreted in your hypothalamus, but the two major ones that you definitely have to know are ghrelin and leptin. So if we go down here to ones that decrease your appetite, insulin is actually going to diminish your blood glucose. This is why diabetics sometimes need to use insulin. And then leptin is the major hunger suppressing hormone. So when there's a lot of leptin, your brain is going to increase its metabolism and decrease its hunger. So it's going to process food more quickly, and it's going to stop sending hungry signals to your brain and instead send I'm full signals to your brain. And then PYY is another digestive tract hormone, which tells the brain when you are not hungry. So just know which hormones increase your appetite and which decrease your appetite but you should really, really, really get used to comparing ghrelin and leptin. Okay, set point and basal metabolic rate kind of go together. So your set point is just the general weight that you tend to hover around. It's just your normal level of weight. And everyone kind of has a different set point. Everyone has a different point at which their body feels is sort of their homeostasis level of weight, right? And so some people, are naturally thinner and smaller than others. Some are a little larger and heavier. And so that largely has to do with the set point, which you can see, fairly early in development that some children have a higher set point than others, right? And so this is just, your specific level of homeostasis when it comes to your weight, your average level of weight or your expected weight. And then when your body falls below that weight, you become hungry and your metabolic rate lowers to make up for and restore that weight. Whereas if you were to, go above the weight, you become less hungry and your metabolic rate increases to make up for that difference. Basal metabolic rate. This is the same thing as metabolism. And so, how quickly you metabolize food is the same thing as saying how quickly does your body process and get rid of food, right? It has to do with how much energy your body exerts processing food. And so if we're looking back up here at set point where I said, if your body falls below your normal weight, your metabolic rate lowers, right? That means you have a slower metabolism. And when you have a slower metabolism, your body holds on to more weight. Versus if your body goes above the set point, you've gained more weight than you normally have on you. Then you don't become hungry, you become full, and your metabolic rate increases. Your metabolism goes faster in order to process more of that food quickly so that you can go back to a lower set point, a thinner set point. And just know really that basal metabolic rate has to do with this idea of energy output. Energy output. How much energy does your body expend processing food? And if it expends, a lot of energy, then you lose weight. If it doesn't expend much energy, you gain weight. Okay, a little bit of a summary here. This is really interesting. When you feel tense or depressed, people tend to eat comfort foods, and comfort foods are high in carbohydrates, which boost serotonin and calm you down. So there is actually something to this idea of comfort foods because eating them boosts your serotonin, which does in fact comfort or calm you down on a neurotransmitter level. Preferences for sweet and salty are genetic and universal, but other flavor preferences can be conditioned. Most people don't like the taste of coffee the first time they drink it, but you can condition that taste preference or that flavor preference by continuing to drink coffee. It's an acquired taste, right? So that's really what this is saying. Other flavor preferences can be conditioned. You can have acquired tastes for other things. And then other taste preferences may be adaptive. So the spices that we most commonly see used in hot climates are actually spices that inhibit the growth of bacteria. And food is most prone to quick bacteria growth in hot climates. So it's kind of interesting because, people weren't thinking, let's use these spices to inhibit the growth of bacteria, because back, when people didn't know the science of that, they couldn't even make those predictions. And so we've seen these spices have been used for years, and it's likely because the people who were using spices that inhibited bacteria growth tended to survive and reproduce, right? And so it passed on that adaptive taste preference for those types of spices in that climate. Another example is that pregnant women have the most nausea and food aversion in the 10th week, which is when the embryo is most sensitive to toxins. So it's an adaptive mechanism to keep toxins away from the embryo. Five situational influences on eating. Appetite is associated with arousal. So if you're watching an action movie, you're likely to eat twice as many snacks as if you were watching something boring like an interview or a documentary. The next influence is social facilitation. The mere presence of other people around us amplifies our natural behavior. So we do more of our natural behaviors when we're in social situations. So eating is one of those things. We tend to eat more when we're in social situations. Next, serving size is significant. People actually eat more if they're given a bigger plate or bowl or a bigger serving. That may partially be confounded by, some parents telling their children that they have to finish what's on their plate, for example. But as it turns out, if you give someone a smaller serving and you offer them a second serving, they won't take it. But if you give them a bigger serving to begin with, they'll eat more, right? Next, food variety stimulates eating. So people eat more when they have more options, which is why if you've ever been to a buffet, you may have noticed that you actually eat much more in the buffet than you do in other places. And that's just because we don't want to choose. We want to have all of the good things, right? And so we end up eating more because we have more options of things to eat. And lastly, ordering effects can contribute to nudging nutrition. So if children are going through a lunch line and you actually put the healthier foods out before the main course food, that encourages people to eat more of the nutritious foods. And this was something that Michelle Obama actually put into practice when she was First Lady, and she was encouraging, healthier eating and healthier school lunch options and stuff like that. But this was one tactic that they did where they put all of the healthy foods at the very start of the lunch line and all of the unhealthy foods at the end of the lunch line, so that people would go for the healthy foods first, fill up their plates, and then wouldn't have much room at the end for the unhealthy foods to be added. Okay. So that was motivation. There's kind of several topics in this chapter, but that was motivation. Now we're on to sex, the sexual response cycle, and also sexual orientation. So what you want to know, and we've talked about this before in chapter 4, but testosterone is the most important male sex hormone. Now, what I want you to write down on your worksheet, which I think I had you write down in chapter 4 too, is that both sexes have both hormones. People think that testosterone is just a male hormone and estrogen is just a female hormone, but that is not true. Both sexes have both hormones. The difference is men tend to have more testosterone than women have, and women tend to have more estrogen than men have. But both males and females both have testosterone and estrogen. And testosterone is the most important male sex hormone, and estrogen is the most important female sex hormone. And then the sexual response cycle. I just can't even imagine running this study that people did to define the sexual response cycle. But nonetheless, we have identified 4 distinct stages of sexual intercourse or sexual responding. The first of these is excitement. I really enjoy this little graph that they've made for this. So you can see in the excitement phase, as time goes on, your arousal increases. Wow, shocking, right? So this is essentially the foreplay stage of sexual intercourse or activity. And then you get to a plateau stage where actually your arousal stays relatively constant for a little while. This is while people are engaging in the sexual act. Next, we have orgasm. Wow, well, would you look at that arousal? Sure shoots up there to a tippy top point, and that tippy top point would be the point of orgasm. And then lastly, we have the resolution stage, where all of your arousal plummets back down to the bottom and you are no longer aroused because you have finished what you came to do. All right, so just know the order of these 4 stages and know sort of how arousal changes in them. So know in excitement, arousal is increasing. In plateau, arousal is staying constant, maybe increasing a tiny bit here or there. In the orgasm stage, your arousal flies up and peaks, and then during the resolution stage, it falls back down to the bottom. And then there is a refractory period at the end here. So just like with a neuron, when we talked about the refractory period of the neuron, we said, after a neuron fires once, it can't fire again right away. And that is true for men as well, for the sexual responding of men. Once a man reaches orgasm, it is impossible for him to reach orgasm again until a certain amount of time has passed. So know that men experience refractory periods, but women do not. Women are able to have orgasms back to back. It doesn't typically happen all that frequently, but it can. And for some women, it does happen very frequently. It depends. But for men, there is no man who can just bypass the refractory period. Every single man experiences a refractory period where he is unable to achieve a second orgasm until some amount of time has passed. Okay, sexual dysfunctions, paraphilias, and other sexual issues. So a sexual dysfunction is a problem that impairs your ability to complete the act of sex. So it impairs some stage of that sexual response cycle: excitement, plateau, orgasm, or what's the other one? Starts with an R. Resolution. There it is. So a sexual dysfunction actually impairs your ability to complete the act of sex properly. So some examples here are erectile disorder. Well, this is an issue with the excitement stage of the sexual response cycle. This is where there's insufficient blood flow to the genitals and a man is not able to achieve an erection, or perhaps they can achieve one but they can't maintain it. That would be more of a plateau stage issue. Female orgasmic disorder. This refers to the distress that some females may experience if they infrequently or sometimes even never experience an orgasm. So you can see that this is an issue with the orgasm stage of the sexual response cycle. Sexual dysfunctions are distinct from paraphilias in very significant ways. So a sexual dysfunction, there's nothing wrong with your sexual preferences by any means. It's simply, it's more of a bodily issue. You have an issue completing the act of sex properly. But paraphilias have to do actually with unusual sexual interests. So unusual sexual attractions, or sexual arousal to unusual things that we consider to be actually problematic. So this would be sexual arousal from fantasies, behaviors, or urges that involve non-human objects, the suffering of yourself or others, or non-consenting persons. And so you might notice sort of this ending here of paraphilia, this ilia ending. So if you think of things like pedophilia, right, or necrophilia. So pedophilia, preying upon children sexually, having a sexual interest in children, or necrophilia, having a sexual attraction to dead bodies. These things end in that same ILIA ending. So if it ends with ilia, it's a paraphilia. Pedophilia is an example, necrophilia is an example. There's several others that end with that ilia sound. And so that is a paraphilia, which is something that we consider to be problematic that actually needs treatment. problematic, that needs treatment. And, I want to talk about this for a hot second, because there's kind of been a surge all of a sudden in this strange belief that pedophilia should be included as a sexual orientation. And that, in the context of psychological science, just doesn't make any sense. Your sexual orientation has nothing to do with age. Your sexual orientation has only to do with what gender or sex of people that you are attracted to. So your sexual orientation doesn't have to do with what race of people you're attracted to. Your sexual orientation doesn't have to do with what age of people you're attracted to. Your sexual orientation only has to do with what gender or sex you're attracted to. And so this idea of being able to include pedophilia as a sexual orientation just is wrong. It's just incorrect, objectively and subjectively. But I don't know who thinks that they can make this argument adequately, but nonetheless, this has kind of been a contemporary issue that we've been dealing with. Now, like I said, pedophilia, right, is a paraphilia. And in psychological science, we say that paraphilias are disorders. They're disordered behaviors. And so a paraphilia is something that you receive treatment for. Your sexual orientation is not considered a disorder, and your sexual orientation is not something you receive treatment for. So just this idea that pedophilia is a sexual orientation is completely face value wrong. And if you look deeper, even more wrong. Just wanted to mention that while we were here. Okay. And then the APA classifies a sexual behavior as being disordered if a person experiences distress from that unusual sexual interest, or it entails harm or the risk of harm to others. Those are the criteria for disordered sexual behavior. And then the book talks a little bit about sexually transmitted infections, STIs or STDs, sexually transmitted diseases. And we found that condoms are 80% effective in preventing the spread of HIV. So, use condoms. They're important. And you should always get regularly STD tested as well. That's something that should be a part of your basic medical care or medical routine. And then AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. So this is this can kill you, a life-threatening sexually transmitted infection that is caused by HIV. People kind of think that they can use HIV and AIDS interchangeably. Not quite. HIV is the initial virus that you contract, and then if you don't treat it, right, then it can develop into full-blown AIDS. So HIV is where everybody starts if they acquire the virus, and then that can progress to AIDS if it's left untreated. And, as the name states, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. What happens here is your immune system gets shot by this disease or by this syndrome. And so it makes you actually much more vulnerable to getting sick from anything else because your immune system is not able to fight off sickness. Okay, so now Dr. Lawrence loves to talk about how many adverse effects there are to watching porn. And that is what this section is talking about. Exposure to sexually explicit material, just means porn, can that have adverse effects? And in fact, research shows that it can in 3 ways. The first is, this is kind of a little bit of an overgeneralization, I would say. But the first is believing that rape is acceptable. There's a very small subset of pornographic material that is, that displays non-consensual sexual activity. And so if you're watching that sort of stuff, it may lead you to believe that rape is acceptable. Or if you're watching the sort of material where, at first a woman doesn't want to do something, then she sort of gets coerced or pressured into doing it, that can give people the idea that it's okay to push people to do things they're uncomfortable doing, right? But really the bigger risk are these last two. Reduce satisfaction with your partner's appearance or with a relationship that you have, because your standards are just ridiculous compared to these, people that you're seeing in sexually explicit films, let's say. And then the third is desensitization. The more you actually view and watch pornographic material, the more you just kind of become used to it, and it actually desensitizes you to really what the full experience of sex is with a real, living, face-to-face person. Okay, risk-taking in teen pregnancy. So to summarize here, these are just some environmental factors that contribute to sexual behavior in teens. The first is communication about birth control. If teens talk openly with their parents or their partner, they are most likely to use contraceptives, which of course will reduce the risk of teen pregnancy. So communication about birth control is really the best thing that you can do as a parent for your child. You don't just, think that, if I never bring up anything sexual, then they're just, never going to do it. You can't make that assumption. So instead, the best move you can make is actually to communicate about how to be safe when your child does eventually begin to have sex. The next factor is impulsivity. So the more impulsive one is, the more likely they are to take risks sexually. And so we see that 72%, that's a high number, of sexually active 12 to 17-year-olds said that they actually regretted having had sex. And then, of course, unplanned or impulsive sex can lead to unplanned pregnancy. Alcohol use. Most hookups occur after alcohol use, so people who have been drinking are also less likely to use condoms because they have poor judgment and poor risk assessment. So the use of alcohol can contribute to, really it factors into impulsivity, which then contributes to sexual risk-taking. And then lastly, mass media. The more sexual content that adolescents or young adults view or read, the more likely they are to perceive their peers as being sexually active and to develop sexually permissive attitudes and to have sex earlier than others. Okay, sexual orientation and enduring sexual attraction to members of your own sex, the other sex, or both sexes. So if it's your own sex, this is a homosexual orientation. If it's the other sex, this is a heterosexual orientation. And if it's both sexes, a bisexual orientation. So again, now that we're looking right at the definition of sexual orientation, you can see how pedophilia would not fit in here because it doesn't have to do with a sexual attraction towards a certain sex. Pedophilia has to do with sexual attraction towards members who are underage, and sexual orientation has absolutely nothing to do with age. It only has to do with what sex, what gender you are sexually attracted to. And then asexual people. Asexual people simply have no sexual attraction to others. And now I think people get confused and they think that really that this just means that asexual people don't like to be touched. That's not necessarily true. Asexual people may very well still want to be in a relationship, and they may still like to do physical things in a relationship, like hold hands, kiss, cuddle. But it's simply that drive that most of us feel towards having sex that is absent in an asexual person. It's something where they just do not experience sexual attraction. But oftentimes, if an asexual is with a partner who's not also asexual, they may have sex with their partner because they know that that's something that their partner wants and needs. But they simply just don't experience a feeling of sexual attraction to anyone. Okay. I want you to write this down, that 3 to 4% of men and 1 to 2% of women are homosexual. Dr. Lawrence loves to ask about this on the test, where she'll be like, blank percent of men and blank percent of women have a homosexual orientation. And the answer is 3 to 4% of men and 1 to 2% of women. 3 to 4% of men, 1 to 2% of women. People are more likely to hide their sexual orientation in less tolerant places, but they are no more or less likely to be homosexual than people living anywhere else in the world. So these stats of 3 to 4% of men and 1 to 2% of women are across all cultures. We have found this. There's no difference in the occurrence of someone being homosexual, in America versus China versus Russia versus Australia, for example. But in less tolerant places, people may hide the fact that they are gay more frequently. Some individuals struggle with their sexual attractions, especially during adolescence, and if they feel as though they are or they will be rejected by their parents or by their peers. Without social support, non-heterosexual teens are actually likely to have lower self-esteem and to develop anxiety and depression and have an increased risk of contemplating suicide. People cannot force their sexual orientation to change, and they can't ignore or deny their sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is neither willfully chosen nor is it willfully changed. So sexual orientation is not something that someone can select. It's not something they can choose, and it's not something that they can change. That is what we've found over and over again in terms of psychological study of sexual orientation. What we do see is that sexual orientation is especially persistent for men, but women's sexual orientation tends to be more fluid. And I think that that's somewhat has to do with social expectations that we put on men versus women. And we can kind of, encourage women that it's more okay to be homosexual or bisexual than it is for men to be, for whatever reason. But as it turns out, women they have more what we call sexual plasticity, which means that they can become sexually aroused at a wide variety of stimuli, versus for men, it usually is more fixed. It's, only the sight of a naked woman or naked man or something like that will arouse men as consistently, I suppose. And then this slide will be really quick. Essentially, we've asked a lot of questions that essentially are asking why people's sexual orientation may be one way or another, right? And so we've had a lot of different theories, like, maybe, homosexuality is linked with a child having a problematic relationship with their parents, like having a domineering mother and an ineffectual father, or a possessive mother and a hostile father. But we see that parenting style has no effect on sexual orientation. Maybe homosexuality involves a fear or a hatred of people of the other sex. Nope, we haven't found that either. Well, is sexual orientation maybe linked with sex hormone levels in the blood? No, it's not. And as children, this must be it, right? Most homosexuals were just molested, seduced, or otherwise sexually victimized, and that's why they became homosexual. No. So the answer to all of these questions is an absolute and an emphatic no. None of these things cause or contribute to sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is something that is determined before you're even born and something that persists for the rest of your life. No environmental effect causes someone to develop a homosexual or a bisexual orientation. When it comes to other species, we see same-sex sexual behaviors in several hundred other species. So it's not just humans that can have a homosexual orientation. There are hundreds of animals that we found that may be homosexual or may engage in homosexual sex. When it comes to brain differences, this is crucial. There's one cell cluster in the hypothalamus that is larger in heterosexuals and smaller in homosexuals. And we actually start to see these differences developing before birth or shortly after birth. So again, this is a genetic link to sexual orientation, not an environmental one. This speaks to the idea that sexual orientation is determined before a child is even born, or certainly before they develop to be very old at all. And then when it comes to brain pattern responses, we actually see that gay men tend to have more female typical brain pattern responses than straight men, and lesbians appear to have more male typical brain pattern responses than straight females. Genetic influences, we think our heritability estimate for sexual orientation is that we think about a third of the variation in sexual orientation is attributable directly to genetic influences. And we do see that identical twins are somewhat more likely than fraternal twins to both have a homosexual orientation. And there are some epigenetic marks that help distinguish gay and straight identical twins. And sexual orientation does link with at least 2 identified areas of chromosomes, or with areas of 2 identified chromosomes is actually the correct way to say that. Prenatal influences. So exposure to the hormone levels typically experienced by female fetuses appears to predispose the person, whether they're male or female, to be attracted to males in later life. So sometimes what happens is you have a male fetus inside your body, but the hormone levels that you would typically experience in a female pregnancy are present in your male pregnancy instead of the male typical hormone levels. And so when this happens, it actually appears to predispose that male fetus to be attracted to males in later life. And it predisposes female fetuses to also be attracted to males in later life. And then there's this phenomenon called the fraternal birth order effect. I want you to write that down on your worksheet here next to prenatal influences. The fraternal birth order effect. Fraternal birth order effect. And that is this phenomena that men who have older brothers, so with each subsequent male that you give birth to, the probability of that male being homosexual increases with each subsequent male pregnancy. So men with older brothers are somewhat more likely to be gay than men without older brothers. And these odds increase with each subsequent male fetus that is given birth to. This has to do with levels of antibodies in a woman's body. When a woman is pregnant with a male fetus, more antibodies are present in her body than when she's pregnant with a female fetus. And as it turns out, those antibodies get somewhat used up with each pregnancy. And so for each subsequent pregnancy that you have lower and lower levels of antibodies with that pregnancy. And so the idea is that there's some kind of correlation between presence of antibodies and having a certain kind of sexual orientation. But just know that the fraternal birth order effect says that, with each subsequent male pregnancy that a woman has, that child increases in their odds of being homosexual. Gay-straight trait differences. So gay males tend to be shorter and lighter than straight males, while lesbian females are heavier than straight females. Gay men's spatial abilities more closely represent those of straight females than of straight males. So there's kind of a common theme here of, gay men having more female typical brain activity and gay women having more male typical brain activity. Both straight women and gay men outperform straight men at remembering objects, spatial locations, and memory game tasks. And some other traits that are different between gay and straight individuals are their fingerprint ridge counts, their auditory system development, their handedness, so whether they're left or right-handed, their occupational preferences, their relative finger lengths, their gender nonconformity, their age of onset of puberty in males, their face structure, and their birth size, birth weight, sleep length, physical aggression, and walking style. Okay, so we are towards the end. Now we are into this affiliation and achievement. So the affiliation need speaks to the basic human need to build relationships and to feel like we are part of a group. Social bonds boosted our early ancestors' chances of survival, so that could be why this need developed, because it was adaptive. And adults who formed attachments were more likely to survive, reproduce, and co-nurture their offspring to maturity. People who have close attachments with others are happier than those who don't, and they live longer. The opposite, essentially, of affiliation is ostracism. This is when you are deliberately excluded from a group. And so I want to pause here for a second, and I have something for you to write down. People notice that there is a correlation between homosexuality and incidence of mental disorders or mental illness. And so people try to use this as an excuse, or let's say a reason, for why homosexuality is wrong and disordered, because, being homosexual leads to other mental illnesses. That's just straight up not true. So what I want you to write down on your worksheet is this: being gay is not linked to mental illness or to suicidal behavior, suicidal thoughts or behavior. Being gay is not linked to mental illness or suicidal behavior. Experiencing ostracism is linked to these things. Being gay is not linked to these things. Experiencing ostracism is linked to these things. And so what we've seen is, over time, as we've becoming more and more, as we have become more and more accepting of different sexualities, the incidence of mental disorder has gone down, because simply the only reason that people who, have a different sexual orientation than heterosexual are at higher risk of developing a mental disorder is because they're at higher risk of experiencing ostracism. They're at higher risk of experiencing ostracism. They're at higher risk, if their family is unaccepting of their sexual orientation, then their family is going to exclude and set them apart, and not engage with them, interact with them, right? So ostracism is actually the link to mental disorder and suicidal behavior. It's not sexual orientation that's linked to these things. But people who have a different sexual orientation from the majority are more likely to experience ostracism from others, which is why the incidence of mental illness or mental disorder is higher in those who have a homosexual orientation, because of the ostracism that they experience. Being shunned threatens our need to belong, and ostracism activates brain areas like the anterior cingulate cortex. That gets asked about all the time, so know that ostracism triggers activity in your brain area of your anterior cingulate cortex. Your anterior cingulate cortex also responds to physical pain. So this is why it literally hurts to be excluded from people, because the same part of your brain that responds to physical pain also responds to social and emotional pain. Okay, towards the end here. So when it comes to social networking, those who spend hours online are actually less likely to know and draw help from real life people. But social media can help us to connect with our friends, stay in touch with extended family, and find support when we're facing challenges. When used in moderation, social networking actually predicts a longer life. Now, again, this is kind of like that arousal curve, right? Where if, you're using too much social media, it'll decrease your life, right? Your lifespan. But when used in moderation, this kind of intermediate level predicts the best outcomes, predicts the longer lifespan. Increased self-disclosure, which is sharing information about yourself over electronic communication, tends to deepen our friendships. And this is something that usually feels safer to do than share intimate details face-to-face with others. And people who spend the most amount of time on social media also tend to be the most narcissistic. And so these are some suggestions for balancing your time in the real world and online. You should monitor your time, see how much time you're actually spending online. Monitor your feelings. Is it distressing when you have to disconnect from the online world? Because that could indicate a problem. You could hide from your more distracting online friends when necessary, and don't post things that you wouldn't care to see from others. When studying, get in the habit of checking your phone and email less often. We can't multitask, so when we study or try to be productive, we need to limit those distractions. And then another thing is you can actually refocus by taking a nature walk. People tend to learn better after a peaceful walk in the park, which refreshes your capacity for focused attention. Okay. And lastly, achievement motivation. And so achievement motivation has to do with your desire to achieve or accomplish something, from meeting some high standard. Grit in psychology refers to essentially persevering through things, even when they're difficult. So if you have grit, you are committed, you are strong in your beliefs, you are someone who is not likely to give up easily. So if you have grit, you have passion and perseverance when it comes to long-term goals. Some strategies for achieving your goals: make resolutions, so set reasonable goals for yourself, not unreasonable ones. Announce your goal to friends and family. We're actually more likely to follow through on things if we've made some kind of public commitment to doing them. Develop an implementation plan, so figure out when, where, and how you're going to progress towards your goal. Monitor and record your progress. Create a supportive environment for yourself. Transform hard-to-do behavior into a must-do habit. And here's the thing too, is once you've done something every day for about 2 months, now it becomes a habit. Now you don't have to put so much attention and energy towards remembering to do it. So once you hit that 2-month mark, something becomes a habit. And then bridge the gap between idea and reality. We often know what we need to do, but we have to make sure we have some kind of practical plan in place to actually achieve the idea we have in mind. And that is all for Chapter 11. Make sure to submit your pre-session worksheet to Canvas, and I will see you on Monday night.